In 2020, a team of geneticists uncovered something that should have shaken the foundations of human history. They found DNA from people who do not exist in the archaeological record. No bones, no skulls, no tools, no burial sites, no names. And yet, their genetic signature is alive today. Hidden inside the genomes of millions of people in West Africa is evidence of a population no one has ever seen. They are not mentioned in textbooks. They are not displayed in museums. They have no reconstructed faces staring back at us from documentaries. But they were real, and they left behind something far more powerful than stone or bone. They left blood. This discovery did not begin with a fossil. It began with a question that wouldn't go away. When researchers analyzed the genomes of several West African populations, they expected to see familiar patterns. The branching tree of Homo sapiens evolving within Africa, spreading outward, mixing with Neanderthals and Denisovans only after leaving the continent. That was the standard model. Africa was supposed to be the origin, the baseline, the starting point. Instead, the data revealed something that did not fit. Segments of DNA appeared that were far too ancient to belong to modern humans alone. These genetic fragments diverged hundreds of thousands of years before the main lineage of Homo sapiens. They were older than expected, stranger than expected, and they did not match Neanderthals. They did not match Denisovans. They did not match any known archaic human group. It was as if another branch of humanity had once existed in Africa, lived there for thousands of years, interbred with our ancestors, and then vanished without leaving a single fossil trace. Imagine discovering fingerprints at a crime scene, only to realize they belong to someone who officially never existed. That is what the genome revealed. Using advanced statistical modeling, scientists tested whether the strange DNA segments could be explained by known population structures. Could it be ancient variation within early Homo sapiens? Could it be the result of long-term isolation between African groups? The models failed. Again and again, the only explanation that fit the data was gene flow from a deeply divergent, now extinct hominin population, a ghost population, not metaphorically, genetically. The divergence time suggested this mysterious group split from the ancestors of modern humans roughly 500,000 to 1 million years ago. That places them around the same time frame as early Homo heidelbergensis or other archaic African hominins. Groups we barely understand and for which fossil evidence is fragmented and incomplete. And yet, while Neanderthals left bones in Europe and Denisovans left fragments in Siberia, this African lineage left nothing but code. How is that possible? Africa's climate does not preserve bone as kindly as colder regions. Heat, humidity, acidic soils, they erase evidence. Fossils decay. DNA breaks down. Entire populations can disappear physically, even while surviving biologically through interbreeding. That is the terrifying beauty of genetics. The genome remembers what the Earth forgets. When scientists examine how much of this ghost DNA exists in modern populations, the numbers were not trivial. Some West African groups appear to carry between 2% and 19% ancestry from this unknown archaic population. 19%. That is not a minor footnote. That is a substantial inheritance. To put that in perspective, most non-African humans carry around 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. This means that, in some cases, the genetic contribution of these invisible African ancestors may be even greater than the Neanderthal contribution in Europe. Let that sink in. There may have been another human species living in Africa alongside early Homo sapiens. They met, they had children, their lineages merged, and then, somehow, one branch disappeared. Extinction does not always mean replacement. Sometimes it means absorption. But here is where it becomes even more unsettling. The genetic fragments are not randomly scattered. Some appear in regions of the genome associated with immune function and adaptation. That suggests these genes were not merely neutral leftovers. They may have offered survival advantages, which raises a dangerous possibility. What if modern humans in West Africa survived certain diseases or environmental pressures partly because of genes inherited from this vanished population? What if the people who no longer exist are still protecting the people who do, and we do not even know their name? There is no skull to measure, no jawbone to compare, no stone tool culture to assign. We cannot reconstruct their faces. We cannot hear their voices. We cannot map their territory with certainty. All we have is probability curves and patterns in nucleotide sequences. But those patterns are stubborn. The models repeatedly show that modern human ancestry in Africa is more complex than a single, clean lineage. Instead of a straight trunk with simple branches, the African evolutionary tree may look more like a braided river, multiple streams splitting, reconnecting, merging again. If that is true, then the story we have told ourselves, that Homo sapiens emerged cleanly in Africa before spreading outward, may be incomplete. Not wrong, but incomplete. There may have been multiple human groups living across the African continent hundreds of thousands of years ago, interacting in ways we are only now beginning to detect. And here is the hardest part to accept. We might never find their bones. If preservation conditions were poor, if their population size was small, if they were geographically isolated, the fossil record could remain silent forever, which means the only reason we know they existed at all is because modern humans carry their genetic echo, a biological whisper from a vanished world. So the question is no longer whether they existed. The question is who they were. Were they physically different from us? Did they look recognizably human? Did they think like us? Did they speak? Did they bury their dead? Or were they something stranger, a parallel version of humanity evolving in isolation, watching early Homo sapiens from across ancient African landscapes? And if they lived among our ancestors long enough to interbreed, what was that encounter like? Conflict? Coexistence? Cooperation? The genome cannot tell us the emotional story, but it tells us something happened. Something big enough to leave a measurable mark tens of thousands of years later. This discovery forces us to confront a deeper idea. Africa was not just the birthplace of modern humans. It may have been a vast mosaic of human forms, overlapping, competing, blending. The true human story may not be a straight line. It may be a network of ghosts. And in West Africa today, those ghosts are still with us. Not as myths, not as legends, but as living sequences of DNA passed from parent to child. Invisible, undocumented, unforgotten by the genome. The next question is even more disturbing. If we miss an entire human population in Africa, a group that contributed up to nearly 1/5 of some people's ancestry, what else have we missed? And how many more ghosts are still hiding in our DNA? To understand how something this enormous could remain hidden for so long, we have to step back and look at how geneticists even detect a ghost. There is no flashing signal in the genome labeled unknown species. There is no tag that says extinct population here. What scientists see are patterns, subtle distortions in the statistical fabric of DNA variation. When researchers compared the genomes of West African populations to global human datasets, they expected differences. Africa holds the deepest genetic diversity on Earth. That much was already known. But what they found went beyond diversity. Certain stretches of DNA were too divergent, too ancient. They branched off far earlier than the main Homo sapiens lineage should allow. It was as if deep in the genetic code, there were fragments that had been evolving separately for hundreds of thousands of years, and then suddenly merged back into human story. That kind of pattern does not appear by accident. To test it, scientists built demographic models, complex simulations that attempt to reconstruct how populations split, migrated, and mixed over time. They ran scenario after scenario. What if early African groups were simply highly structured and isolated for long periods? What if ancient Homo sapiens populations had deep sub-branches that later reconnected? What if mutation rates were slightly misestimated? Each time, the models were adjusted, and each time something was missing, the data stubbornly demanded an additional source, a population that had diverged from the ancestors of modern humans long before the main Homo sapiens expansion, a population that no longer exists independently. Think about what that means. For decades, the dominant narrative was simple. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa around 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, gradually expanded across the continent, and later left Africa roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. Along the way, they encountered Neanderthals and Denisovans outside Africa, interbred with them, and absorbed small percentages of their DNA. Africa, in that story, was mostly a single evolving lineage, but the ghost DNA changes that picture entirely. It suggests that Africa was not just home to early Homo sapiens. It was home to multiple human populations, some of which were as genetically distinct from us as Neanderthals were from Europeans. Except this time, the mixing happened inside Africa, long before humans ever left the continent. This means the so-called pure African origin model was too clean, too linear, too simple. Instead of a single ancestral population, there may have been a network of ancient human groups scattered across different ecological zones, forests, savannas, river systems, separated by geography, climate, and time. Some may have been small, isolated, rare. Others may have thrived for tens of thousands of years. And at some point they met. The genomic data suggests that this interbreeding event did not happen once. It may have occurred multiple times over extended periods. Imagine early Homo sapiens moving through West Africa, encountering another human population that had been evolving separately for 500,000 years. They were not animals. They were not myths. They were human enough to produce fertile offspring, but genetically distinct enough to leave a detectable signal 500,000 years later. What did they look like? We do not know. There are fossil fragments in Africa, skull pieces, jawbones, isolated remains, that do not fit neatly into the Homo sapiens category. Some are classified as archaic Homo. Some are debated. Some are controversial. Could one of those mysterious fossils belong to this ghost population? Possibly, but without ancient DNA from those fossils, which is extremely difficult to extract in African climates, we cannot confirm it. That is the brutal irony. The continent that holds the deepest roots of humanity is also the hardest place to preserve ancient DNA. Heat destroys genetic material. Microbes break it down. Time erases it. In Europe and Siberia, coal cave protected Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA for tens of thousands of years. In much of Africa, those conditions rarely exist, so the evidence disappears. Except inside us, the genome becomes an archive, and that archive is starting to reveal something even more unsettling. The ghost DNA is not evenly distributed. Some West African populations carry significantly more of it than others. That suggests the interbreeding events were localized, perhaps confined to certain regions or ecological zones. It was not a continent-wide blending. It was specific, targeted by geography. This raises another question. Could these ghost populations have survived in isolated pockets long after Homo sapiens became dominant? Could they have persisted quietly, outnumbered but not extinct, slowly merging into larger populations over thousands of years? We have seen similar patterns before. Neanderthals did not vanish overnight. They dwindled, mixed, and gradually disappeared as a separate lineage. But Africa's story might be even more complex. Because here, we are not dealing with one known archaic group. We are dealing with something we cannot even name. And then comes the most profound implication of all. If up to nearly 1/5 of some people's ancestry traces back to this unknown population, then the idea of a single isolated modern human lineage collapses. There was no moment when Homo sapiens stood alone. From the very beginning, we may have been a braided lineage, shaped by multiple human groups blending together across deep time. The human species may not be a clean branch on the evolutionary tree. It may be a fusion, and that changes how we see ourselves. It means that modern identity, biologically speaking, is the result of ancient meetings we barely understand, encounters that left no written record, no cave art, no preserved skeletons, only sequences of A, T, C, and G buried in our chromosomes. But here is where the tension deepens. If we can detect one ghost population in West Africa, it is statistically unlikely to be the only one. Africa is vast, ecologically diverse, deeply ancient. How many other archaic populations lived and died without fossil traces? How many genetic contributions remain hidden because we have not sampled the right communities or applied the right models? The story may not be finished. We may be standing at the edge of a far more complicated map of human origins, a map where modern human is not a starting point, but convergence. And somewhere in that convergence, a population without a name, without a face, without a fossil, still lives on in millions of people today. The question is no longer whether they existed. The question is how much of them is still inside us. Now imagine this for a moment. You are standing in West Africa 200,000 years ago. The air is heavy with humidity. Rivers cut through dense forests. Open savannas stretch beyond the tree line. Early Homo sapiens are already here, making tools, forming social groups, raising children. But they're not alone. Somewhere beyond the next ridge or across the next river basin, another human population exists. Not identical, not completely different, close enough to recognize each other as human, but distant enough to have evolved separately for hundreds of thousands of years. They have their own history, their own adaptations, their own survival strategies shaped by a landscape that shifts between wet and dry cycles over millennia. And then, at some point, their worlds intersect. What happens in that moment? Genetics tells us one thing with certainty. It was not a brief, accidental encounter. The signal in modern DNA is too strong for that. The ghost ancestry appears in structured patterns, suggesting repeated contact or prolonged coexistence. This was not a single meeting. It was interaction. But here is where the mystery becomes deeper. If two human populations live close enough to interbreed, why do we not see clear archaeological traces of two distinct cultures overlapping in West Africa from that time period? The answer may lie in something subtle but powerful: cultural similarity. If this ghost population was behaviorally comparable to early Homo sapiens, using similar tools, living in similar shelters, exploiting similar resources, their material culture might be indistinguishable in the archaeological record. Two populations could leave behind nearly identical stone tools, making it impossible to tell them apart thousands of years later. From the outside, they would look like one, but genetically they were not. This challenges one of the most comforting assumptions in paleoanthropology, that distinct species must leave distinct artifacts. What if they do not? What if ancient Africa was full of human groups who looked similar, behaved similarly, but have been evolving separately for 500,000 years? That would mean our ancestors were not the sole protagonists of their story. They were participants in a much larger human ecosystem. Now consider another angle. Climate in Africa has not been stable. Over the last million years, massive shifts in rainfall transformed landscapes again and again. Forests expanded, then retreated. Deserts grew, then shrank. River systems changed course. These environmental fluctuations could have isolated populations for tens of thousands of years, splitting them apart long enough to diverge genetically, before bringing them back into contact when climate shifted again. In other words, separation and reunion may have been a repeating pattern. Every time climates reconnected regions, populations that had evolved independently could have met again, and every reunion would leave a genetic trace. This braided model of evolution explains something critical: why the African genetic landscape is so much more complex than previously thought. But here is the part that should unsettle us. If early Homo sapiens repeatedly mix with other human groups inside Africa, then the boundary between us and them becomes blurry. At what point do we stop calling them a different species? If they could interbreed and produce viable offspring, were they truly separate? Or were they simply another branch of humanity, as real and valid as the lineage that eventually dominated? Modern humans often think of evolution as a ladder, one line progressing upward, others fading away. But this discovery suggests something closer to a web. Multiple lines moving, touching, merging. And perhaps no single line can claim purity. The ghost population complicates identity in a profound way, because it means that what we call modern human is partly the result of ancient hybridization events that happened entirely within Africa. For a long time, admixture, mixing with archaic humans, was framed as something that happened after humans left Africa, a kind of side chapter involving Neanderthals and Denisovans. But now we know that Africa itself was a zone of admixture, and possibly on a much larger scale. Some researchers have even suggested that as much as 8 to 19% of ancestry in certain West African groups may derive from this deeply divergent lineage. That is not a footnote. That is foundational. It forces a radical rethink. Perhaps Homo sapiens did not emerge as a single isolated species that later absorbed others. Perhaps Homo sapiens emerged from the fusion of multiple African populations. If that is true, then the ghost population is not an anomaly. It is part of our origin story. And here is the most chilling thought of all. If the fossil record is incomplete, and we know it is, then entire chapters of human evolution may have unfolded without leaving a single skeleton we can study. Think about that. There may have been human groups with unique anatomies, unique brain structures, unique cognitive traits, and we may never know what they look like. Their bones returned to soil. Their artifacts eroded. Their names were never written. But their genes survived because they mixed. It is almost poetic. Biology preserves what history forgets. And yet there is still uncertainty. The ghost population has not been directly observed. It is inferred through statistical signals. Could future models revise these estimates? Possibly. Could more ancient DNA discoveries reshape the picture? Almost certainly. Science evolves. But right now, the weight of evidence points towards something extraordinary. West Africa was home to at least one deeply divergent human lineage that interacted extensively with early Homo sapiens. A lineage that vanished as a separate entity, not through violent replacement necessarily, but through absorption, which leads to a final question that lingers over everything. If they are gone as a population, but alive in the genome, are they truly extinct? Or do they survive every time a child is born carrying fragments of their ancient DNA? The ghost population of West Africa may never have a reconstructed face in a museum, but they are not imaginary. They are written into living humanity. And if this is only the beginning of what genomics can reveal, then the human story is far from complete. There may be more ghosts waiting, hidden, patient, encoded in us. If you zoom out far enough, the discovery of ghost DNA in West Africa stops being just a scientific curiosity. It becomes something much larger, a shift in how we understand what it means to be human. For most of modern history, we have told ourselves a clean story, a single origin, a single species, a straight evolutionary line rising from primitive to advanced. It was simple, elegant, comforting, but reality is rarely simple. The genetic evidence now suggests that humanity did not emerge from isolation. It emerged from contact, from meetings, from mixtures, from populations that split apart for hundreds of thousands of years, and then came back together. The idea of a lone ancestral group standing at the root of all modern humans may be a myth of oversimplification. Instead, early Africa may have been filled with overlapping human forms, some dominant, some rare, some destined to disappear, others destined to merge. And somewhere in that tangled web, the ghost population lived. They walked African landscapes long before recorded history. They survived climate swings, predators, disease. They adapted in ways we can only infer. They developed traits that were distinct enough to be recognized in DNA 500,000 years later. And then something happened, not a dramatic extinction event, not necessarily a catastrophic wipeout, but gradual absorption, lineages blending until one identity swallowed the other. Over time, their separate existence dissolved. Their language, if they had one, vanished. Their traditions, if they had them, disappeared without record, but their biology endured. And that changes the emotional weight of extinction, because extinction does not always mean disappearance. Sometimes it means transformation. The ghost population may not exist as a separate group today, but parts of them are alive in millions of people. Their genetic code influences immune systems, adaptation, perhaps even subtle biological traits we have not yet identified. In a quiet way, they are still here, and this forces a deeper question. How many times did this happen? If Africa contained one deeply divergent lineage that mixed with Homo sapiens, it is statistically improbable that it was alone. The continent is vast, larger than Europe, China, and the United States combined. Its ecological diversity creates natural isolation zones where populations could diverge for tens of thousands of years. Each isolated pocket is an evolutionary experiment. Each reconnection is an opportunity for fusion. It is entirely possible that early Homo sapiens interacted with multiple archaic populations within Africa, some leaving detectable traces, others erased beyond recovery. The ghost DNA we see today may only be the strongest surviving signal. There could have been others whose contributions were diluted below statistical detection, others who left no measurable trace at all. That possibility reframes human evolution as something dynamic, almost chaotic, not a march forward, but a constant negotiation between neighboring groups, and that reshapes identity. If modern humans are partly the product of ancient admixture events inside Africa, then the very concept of a pure lineage collapses. From the beginning, humanity may have been hybrid. The boundaries between species blur. The definition of Homo sapiens becomes less about isolation and more about convergence. We are not the end of a straight branch. We are the intersection of many. There is something humbling about that. It strips away the illusion of singular superiority. It reminds us that our existence may depend on populations we never knew, populations that survived long enough to share their genes before fading into the background of history. And yet, science is still in the early stages of uncovering this complexity. As sequencing technologies improve, as more African populations are studied with greater depth and representation, the picture will sharpen. Ancient DNA extraction techniques are advancing. New statistical tools are being developed. The map of human origins is being redrawn in real time. What once looked like a simple trunk with branches now resembles braided rivers merging and separating across deep time. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this story is not scientific. It is existential. For thousands of years, humans have asked, where do we come from? The ghost DNA discovery answers that question in a way few expected. We come from each other, from meetings across valleys and rivers, from shared firelight between groups once separated by deep evolutionary time, from unions that history never recorded but biology never forgot. Somewhere in West Africa, long before cities, long before writing, long before even the concept of modern human, two populations stood face to face. They were different enough to carry distinct genetic histories, but similar enough to create a future together. And that future is us. The ghost population may never have a name carved in stone. We may never reconstruct their faces or hear their voices. Their skeletal remains may never surface from African soil. But they are not myth. They are written into chromosomes, encoded in immune responses, passed silently from parent to child for tens of thousands of years. Every time modern science sequences another genome, it listens for echoes of them, and those echoes are still there. So the next time we speak about human origins, the story should no longer begin with a single lineage rising alone. It should begin with a landscape full of humans, some familiar, some forgotten, whose lives intertwine in ways we are only beginning to understand. The ghost DNA in West Africa is not just evidence of a lost population. It is proof that humanity's past is far more complex, far more interconnected, and far more mysterious than we ever imagined. And if our own genomes can hide an entire vanished people for hundreds of thousands of years, then one thing is certain. We are still only scratching the surface of who we truly are.